When we were assigned this project, I thought it would be easy. I thought I'd be able to do some research and figure out what life was actually like in the 30s and the 40s. However, I learned that this project is so much more than just a research English project. This was people's lives. I was able to talk to my mother and my grandmother about the history they knew of our family and what it was like to live during that era. I started with my family tree, and I thought I knew my family. I had my parents and my grandparents, but really beyond that I was unsure. I was able to learn the names and the locations of all of my family members beyond my grandparents. Just knowing the names of my family was not enough. I wanted to know the real history. I wanted to know where they came from and what life was like during the 30s and the 40s. To do this, I spoke with my mother and my grandmother. The first question I asked my mother was regarding a language that she and my grandmother spoke quite often. Though it was not a full language, it was just always a couple weird words. However, I wanted to know where it came from. She said she asked a similar question when she was a young child to her grandfather.
Where are you from? Or what are you? We didn't say where are you from. We were little, didn't really think about saying it that way. But we said, well, what are you? And he used to say, I'm Spanish. Well, where are you from? I'm from Greece. So later on, when I was interested in finding out more about my family and our roots and where we came from, I learned about the fact, in fact, that my grandfather wasn't speaking Spanish. He was speaking a language called Ladino, which was spoken by the Sephardic Jews. These are the Jews of the Mediterranean. These Jews were actually from Spain originally, and they lived a very good life in Spain for many, many, many years. In 1492, when Isabella took over, the Jews left Spain. Obviously, she kicked them all out, and my family, from what my research showed, went to Turkey and lived in Turkey for a very, very long time. And when the Turkish decided that they didn't want the Jews anymore, my family went to Greece, and they settled in the Isle of Rhodes. I decided to go find out some more information about my family, and I went to Greece 2 years ago. I went to Rhodes. I went to the synagogue where there were a lot of records of my family, and I found out that this was actually one of the oldest synagogues in Europe. It was a synagogue where my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents and even one more great-great-great it was their synagogue. They all got married there. It was just fascinating. And somebody told me to go to this woman, Carmen, and she would have the books of everybody's family. So I finally found her, and she opened these books, and I got to see birth certificates, marriage certificates, names, all of my relatives with this name Pesanti. But when the Italians occupied Rhodes, I don't know the year, but the Italians came in, and they were not fond of the Jews, and they didn't make life easy. They closed down a lot of their shops, they moved their cemetery. It wasn't a good situation, and a lot of people fled at that time, and my family did leave.
My family first fled to Israel, where they stayed for many years, but then made the travels over to the United States and came in through Ellis Island in New York, and then traveled to Georgia, and then finally made their way to California with the hope of new jobs and opportunities. After learning about the history of my family, I knew I needed to move on and see what real life was like. I spoke with my grandmother, my only living relative who was alive during the 30s and 40s, to see what life was actually like.
So it was a lot of fun growing up in Hollywood. When in the 40s, my girlfriend and I, Lila, went to Hollywood quite frequently, and we took the bus on, which was Adams Boulevard to La Brea Boulevard, La Brea, Boulevard to Sunset Boulevard, and everybody knows where Sunset Boulevard is. And we used to go to the radio shows. Let's see, I was 11, so that 1943. That was during the war, but we still went on the bus and we went to the radio shows, which there wasn't any much. There was TV at that time, but very few people could afford it. So we saw the Hit Parade, which is in 1943 and 44, and 45, I believe. It was Andy Russell, who you probably never heard of, and then of course you probably heard of Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra was on the Hit Parade later on, from 44 to 45 and beyond that, but I'm not quite sure. But it was a lot of fun. One time, my girlfriend and I took that trip to Hollywood, and we had $1 each extra, besides our 9 cents to get on the bus. And we went to the Brown Derby, thinking we would eat lunch. The Brown Derby was the most famous restaurant in Hollywood, and the Brown Derby was hoping when you go there to see movie stars, but unfortunately my girlfriend and I didn't see any movie stars, and you couldn't eat lunch for $1, you could only have a Coke. And that was in 1943 or 44, right around that time.
However, growing up in that time period was not all about seeing movie stars and enjoying Hollywood. It was a period of true struggle for families across the nation.
I was born in the Depression, and my father used to tell us stories about how he didn't have a job and how he sold oranges and apples on Wilshire Boulevard, which is a very famous boulevard in Los Angeles. That's how he made a living in the early 30s. In 1937, my father heard that he could make a lot of money if you got into the motion picture industry, which he tried many times to do, but couldn't get in. So he, at that time, was working for a florist, and he sold flowers on Melrose Boulevard in Los Angeles and Wilshire Boulevard. And what he did was, one day he went to the gate at one of the motion picture industries. I think it was Warner Brothers, and he he said that he had a huge bouquet, which he did in his arms. He had a huge bouquet for the executive, Mr. Warner. They called the office and they said, well, let him come in to the gate, I'll see him. So Mr. Warner accepted the flowers personally and said to my dad, how did you get past the gate? He said, well, I really need a job, and this was the only way that I could get in to see you. And Mr. Warner said, if you have guts enough to get past the gate and come in that way, then you deserve a job. And he said, well, what can you do? He said, my dad said I can do anything.
One of the major events of this time was World War II, and of course this did not go unmentioned in my interview.
It was a song that we sang when we were 8 years old. Do you want me to sing it? I couldn't think of it. Mussolini was a whistle while you work. Hitler was a jerk. Mussolini was a meanie, whistle while you work.
What was the
Everybody
Japanese
sang
guy?
that going home. And that was part of our growing up. I mean, that was the mentality of hate, because our country was being thought we were going to be bombed. And of course, the English people, we saw it on the news every time we went to the movies, how the poor English got bombed every day, and France and Italy, and it was very sad and frightening. During the war, food was rationed, and we had, my mother would have a book. We, as little kids, we weren't really too much aware of it, but as I look back now, it was a very important thing that happened, because you couldn't get sugar. You had to have a ration, a book that said sugar, and you could only have so many tickets for sugar. You could only have so many tickets for meat, and so many tickets for gas, and you didn't get that much meat. My mother would say to the butcher, "Can't I have a little bit more?" He said, "No, you can only get whatever amount that you have in the book, whatever coupons you have." But it was a frightening time, and yet it was a good time. Before the war, I can remember everything being happy and no fear.
Talking to my family members taught me more than any history book could. I learned about the period that they lived in, as well as the history of my family. I look forward to being able to tell people where my family truly does come from and be knowledgeable on the subject.